is the Vagelos Computational Science Center, and I'm the Associate Director. My name is Saima Akhtar. And the series runs for the academic year and features talks from scholars and practitioners in computational fields who explore what diversity, equity, and inclusion looks like in STEM. So the idea for the series emerges out of an urgent need to more fully consider the ethical and social implications of computing and its applications. For example, in designing addictive social media platforms or in using AI for facial or name recognition, or racial biases in job hiring or restrictions on personal freedoms through public and private surveillance. To better understand how to counter these biases, this series attempts to rethink STEM disciplines with computational components in them. We invite one speaker every month to speak about the work they're doing to diversify and broaden inclusion in their fields by either sharing their research and experiences or their thoughts on how power structures within computing disciplines should be transformed to create more equitable systems. And with that, again, I'm really excited to introduce Jiahao Chen, who is the incoming Chief Technology Officer at Parity AI, a startup focused on AI ethics and bridging the translation gap between risk, legal, and data teams. He is an outgoing AI research director at JP Morgan AI Research in New York, with research focusing on holistic design of responsible AI systems, incorporating fairness, explainability, privacy, governance, etc., as first-class considerations. He was previously a senior manager of data science at Capital One, focusing on machine learning research for credit analytics and retail operations. When still in academia, Jiahao was a research scientist at MIT CSAIL, where he co-founded and led Julia Lab, focusing on applications of Julia programming language to data science, scientific computing, and machine learning. Jiahao has organized JuliaCon, the Julia Conference, between the years 2014 and 16, as well as organized workshops at NeurIPS, SIAM, CSE, and the American Chemical Society national meetings. Jiahao has authored over 120 packages for numerical computation, data science, and machine learning for the Julia programming language, in addition to numerous contributions to the base language itself, and has published over 50 peer-reviewed papers. And with that, Jiahao, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the invitation. And thank you all for joining at 6 o'clock after daylight saving. I always feel like it's a bit of an ask to stay so late. This is meant to be interactive, so please feel free to type things in the chat, and we can talk about things. Feel free to unmute yourself if you're comfortable. Just a reminder that this is being recorded, so please feel free to participate as you're comfortable. So I'm here to talk about mainly about my work, a little bit about who I am, and just a little bit of thinking about like lived experience and how that influences the way I think about my particular work right now. So let me start with a few basic facts about financial services in the US. So let me do a Q&A. I'll ask the audience to use the Zoom React buttons here just to answer this question. So how many households in New York City don't have a bank account? They gave away the answer. All right, sorry, pretend you didn't see that. Wow, okay, I am not doing this PowerPoint thing. Yeah, so please go ahead and pretend you didn't see those two signs, and if you feel comfortable, please feel free to use the React buttons to vote. All right, so I'm seeing a couple of 21%. I'm seeing a few 11%. Okay, all right, yeah. So so the correct answer is 11% as of the most recent study in 2017. But the people who chose 21% are also not wrong, because 11% is the number of unbanked households. So these are the households that don't have bank accounts, but underbanked households, which are defined as having a bank account, but in the they still go to what they call alternative finance providers. So things like payday loans or cash checking, these are considered underbanked. And that number is 21% as of the most recent study in 2017. So there's a really great report from the City of New York and I believe it's the FTC that did the study. And also, if you're interested, there's a whole bunch of statistics that we can talk about here. But really, this is just to show that we even know what are the primary features that correlate with being in a household that is unbanked or underbanked. All right, so the next question is, how many adults in the United States have a limited credit history? And this limited credit history is like, I don't have enough information to compute a credit score. So, and those of you who have tried to buy a house or apply for a credit card, you know that credit scores are things that people care about. Okay, so we have some votes for 29%, some votes for 14%, 3%. Okay, cool. So the answers from the most recent census data from 2010 is 14%, and this is the reference to a published version of a note that was originally a report that was out of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, one of the primary regulators of consumer finance in this country. And 45 million adults in the United States have a limited credit history, and this includes the various kinds of subgradations of what it means to have not enough information. All right, the last one, perhaps the most contentious one. How many humans did JP Morgan Chase own in history? One of the reactions is the astonished face, just to point that out. Yeah. All right. So, oh, okay. Some people are going for the high numbers. Okay. Oh, so the answer is 1,250 as of the best available records that we can find. So this is a really interesting little segue into the history of the company, that it has, as you might know, JP Morgan is the amalgamation of many, many different banks, including these two banks in Louisiana that was specializing in plantation finance in the 19th century. And unfortunately, there are now historical records to show that that there were as many as 13,000 humans that were pledged as collateral on loans, and between the actual loans that defaulted, the bank actually ended up owning over 1,000 of them. Also interesting here, we can talk about this if anyone's interested, that this was actually part of a disclosure requirement to do business in the city of Chicago. All right, so why am I at a startup now? A little bit about me, who I am. So I'm sorry, this is a bit cut off, but I was born and raised in Singapore. So if you look at that little dot there, that little bright dot at the tip of the Asian continent is me. I was born here. I worked at the National Lab there. I went to school across the world in the University of Illinois, where I got all my formal degrees in chemistry, applied mathematics, and chemical physics. I did some work in some of the earliest work on using machine learning to understand chemical simulations, taking very complicated reaction simulations and distilling them down to very intuitive one-dimensional representations of what people call chemistry or chemical mechanisms. I from there moved on to MIT, where I did my postdoc there. I did a lateral switch to go into computer science. And I am really bad at this, I apologize. I worked heavily on the Julia programming language, which is an open source project out at MIT. So we can talk about DEI in open source projects if you like. And then at the beginning of 2017, I decided that it was a time for a change. I went to New York to start my industry career. So I was data scientist at Capital One. I worked on building models of customer satisfaction, customer monitoring. And I got really interested there in the question of why is it so hard to use AI in this industry? And after doing a bit of legwork, it turns out that the real challenge here is showing that that AI systems are compliant, and it's part of it's because like this industry is very old, it's very mature, and it has made a lot of mistakes that needed fixing, and that's why we have regulations in place to prevent those historical mistakes from recurring. This was what brought me to JP Morgan when I was offered the position of AI Research Director to spearhead work in understanding the intersection of AI compliance and responsible AI design. How do we think about fairness and explainability as core design concepts in the design of AI systems? And I've now gone over to the startup that's called Parity, which I will now talk about. So this is the team that we have today. My co-founder, Liz O'Sullivan, she's quite well known for her work in the AI startup space. She's been in this area for about 10 years. She was also a very important activist in the New York City area. So she was part of this project called STOP, which was working on preventing the further growth of police surveillance through AI. So we also have Alexander, who joins us from the electronic health records industry, Mike McKenna, who joins us from CBS, where he was responsible for doing analytics to make sure that the rollout of the vaccine at Project Warp Speed was not inadvertently leading out any particular communities that were historically disadvantaged. And on the bottom, we have our advisory board. So we have Ruman Chowdhury, who was the original founder of Parity. She built the responsible AI practice at Accenture, is currently doing that work at Twitter. Barry Williams, some of you may recognize as one of the whistleblowers on Facebook when they had their housing discrimination lawsuit. And David is our financial advisor, Irina is our UX designer. So we're currently 4 full-time, and we have 4 part-time in some sort of advisory position. Now, why is this the company we're starting? Because over and over and over again in the last few years, we keep seeing examples of AI applications in industry that don't engender trust. Something goes wrong, and it's not, almost all the time, it's not actual malicious intent, but nonetheless, the effect of using AI somehow has this consequence of then like excluding the people that they're trying so hard to include. Now, we can talk about why that is, but I wanted to also put out there, what is responsible AI? I've already used this term a few times, and it means different things to different people. Responsible AI sometimes means that it's about fairness, it's about explainability, it's about privacy, it's about like this laundry list of things that you need to think about. But I think there's actually a simpler definition that makes it not this laundry list of concerns, but it's really just understanding that AI systems have multiple stakeholders, and you want to design and execute and implement these systems with all the relevant stakeholders in mind, not necessarily the person who is paying the bill to develop the AI system, but also understanding that legal and compliance are also stakeholders that are important, stakeholders that represent like the target demographic, the target market. These are also people that ought to be included in that design process as well, because ultimately it affects them. All right. So I'm going to spend the bulk of my time to talk about why fairness and explainability exists as regulatory needs in financial services. I wrote this very short review paper about it, and I should actually update this because there have a few more papers about this that I've done. Let me start with, there is a need for banks to explain how they give consumers credit. So if you come in and you ask for a credit card, I can't just say yes or no. I actually have to give you a reason. So I might give you some reason, like I don't like your job, or maybe I don't like that you drive an orange car, or the fact that you're a woman. So now this is clearly a sort of a straw man list of arguments, because some of these are obviously bad. Some of them are maybe relevant, and it's not really clear in some other cases. Well, we can talk about that as well. But in general, what policies are acceptable depend on the specific jurisdiction, the country, sometimes the individual state or locality. But usually there's a fairness or explainability requirement implicit in those regulations. So here's the next interactive section, which is pretending to be a bank. and we can do a poll as to whether or not you think these are fair or unfair decision policies. So let's start with the warm-up. So if you're a man, I'm going to give you the credit card. Otherwise, I won't give you the credit card. So what do you think? Feel free to use the reactions if you like. Yeah. So I see some no's. Yeah. All right. All right. I think this is really just a test of who's willing to use the react buttons here. Okay. Awesome. All right. So would anyone like to explain why this is unfair? Feel free to do so in the chat or unmute yourself if you like. All right.
I can like think of a way. A reason
Yes.
one is that it should not matter what gender you are for depending on whether you will give me a loan or not. As simple as that. I mean.
Okay. Great. Yeah. So I think this is the intuition that we have about what it means to be fair or unfair. It's like we cannot make decisions based on who you are, and if in this context, let's kind of look at it. Yeah, that's another great point. It has nothing to do with how likely you are to pay back the loan. So that's another really excellent point. So let's discuss legally what's going on here. So I'm not a lawyer, but I do know a little bit about fair lending regulation. So let's talk about what it means from a legal perspective. So first of all, the Civil Rights Act, which was passed in the late 60s, early 70s, defines something called the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. And it says that it is illegal to discriminate on the basis of your membership in a protected class. For example, sex is one such protected class, race is another, age is another, and there are others that we can discuss as well. And this idea that you're making an explicit decision on the basis of whether or not you belong in that class or not is considered this disparate treatment. I'm really bad at this, I'm sorry. I'm going to skip this. Yeah, so disparate treatment on the basis of protected class membership is not allowed. This is an example of disparate treatment. All right, so the next question. If you live in this zip code 10027, which those of you who go to Barnard might recognize, if you live in this zip code, I'm going to give you a credit card. Otherwise, I'm not going to give you the credit card. So let's ask again. Please respond as you think whether it's fair or not. Okay. So all right. So here we have some difference of opinion. So would anyone who said yes, this is fair, want to make a case for it?
I think it's fine because it doesn't directly discriminate against anybody, but this could be like an important information on deciding whether a person will pay back.
Okay, that's a fair point. Anyone who said no want to make a case for why this is unfair?
Sure, I'll go. I know that zip code is often a good approximation for race. And so in a way, you might not be using a protected class, but you can approximate it.
Okay, no, that's another great point. So both of you are correct. Yeah. So let me just go through this idea of like zip code as a proxy for race. So this historical practice known as redlining is something that even the federally owned banks, the government-owned banks of the United States, actively practiced in the early to mid 20th century before they were outlawed as part of the Civil Rights Act. Now, what they were doing is literally drawing maps of cities. This happens to be a map of Philadelphia. And they were literally coloring in good neighborhoods and bad neighborhoods. And because they use red for this practice became known as redlining. And it's something that the current regulators today are still very much interested in detecting and preventing. Yeah, no, so this is definitely something where it's not obvious until you have to think about the historical and sociological aspects of like why this is an interesting or possible proxy for race. So just to finish up this particular thought, you can still see the demographic effects of redlining even 60, 80, almost 100 years on. You can still see the very strong correlation between living in a neighborhood that was historically redlined and being a majority-minority neighborhood. Now, there's a really interesting question here that was brought up about why this might be fair. Now, the question is, well, but doesn't this also correlate with the economic viability of that neighborhood anyway? And unfortunately, the answer is yes, it does correlate. And this is yet another thing, right? So yes, you can't make a decision based on race, but if you live in that neighborhood, you might also be correlated with having a low probability of needing that mortgage, or like maybe you belong in a different customer segment that I normally service. Like maybe I service, so my products that are tiered for like, I don't know, people who live in mansions and have excellent credit. Like maybe I wouldn't qualify for this if I lived in a historically disadvantaged neighborhood where there are no mansions and like the average household income is 30,000 a year instead of, I don't know, 500,000 a year or something like that. So I think that this idea of like functioning as a background check for economic status is also very important. And in fact leads on to something I'll talk about in another minute. So I'll do a last one. So this is just saying that if your credit score as an applicant exceeds this particular threshold of 670, and I'm really bad at this today, I'm sorry. So yeah, I will give you the credit card if your credit score exceeds 670 points. Otherwise, I won't give it to you. And that's my only decision. So how many people say it's, yeah. So a few no's still, a few yeses. All right, so, okay. Anyone want to say no? Anyone want to make the case for no?
Well, I was thinking no, only because it seemed arbitrary. Like why 670? Why not 650?
Okay, that's a fair point. We can talk about that in a minute. Anyone want to make the case for yes?
I assume that 670 is something that is arrived by ML regression or something like that, and then using credit score and a threshold, I think it's fair because it would also tell me how much amount they can pay back, how much they have been paying back their history. So it is a good enough metric to measure a person payback probability.
Okay, no, both excellent points. So credit score is a metric that was designed to measure credit worthiness, and so it makes sense that we're using this feature, this credit score, to make that decision. 670 might look arbitrary, but let's go through this. So it's just to recap, what exactly is the situation here? So there's no explicit decision on race, sex, or other protected class. But now the question is there possibly some sort of indirect dependence through the use of credit score? So this is clearly not a situation of disparate treatment where you're explicitly decisioning based on either the membership in a protected class or a variable that's known to be highly correlated with protected class. But maybe there's this question of disparate impact. So rather than saying, I use race as an input, what if the outcome is still correlated with race anyway? And so this is the doctrine of disparate impact, which is a completely different notion of discrimination, where a facially neutral policy such as this, it has nothing to do with race or gender or age on the surface, may still result in a discriminatory outcome. All right, so to answer this question of why 670 points. So first of all, let's go through the fact that there is no such thing as the credit score in this country. In fact, there are many, many credit scores, but one of the most popularly used ones comes from this company called MyFICO, formerly known as Fair Isaac, and they publish the FICO credit score, which itself is not a single credit score, but rather a amalgamation of different scores, which are used for different lending purposes. But in general, if you go to their website, this is what they publish and say that this is these are the various tiers. So first of all, the credit score values range from about 300 to 850, and 670 is chosen on purpose because it's the dividing line between what people call prime and subprime. So if you have good credit and above, which is defined as having a 670 score or higher, then this is considered a good score and it qualifies you for most financial products. Whereas something below that is subprime. It's in the same context of subprime mortgages, that you may have heard about, and that would make you less eligible for financial products, or maybe you would be qualified not for the original tier of financial product that you want, but maybe like a lower tier due to your increased credit risk. And then finally, the slide on the graph on the left tells you what is the composition of this number. Like these are the various pieces that go into a credit score. All right, so putting all of that together, now let's ask the question of indirect evidence. Is there evidence for indirect correlation? And unfortunately, the answer is yes. So first of all, here's another study from the Federal Reserve System that shows that there is actually a very strong racial correlation between credit score and your race. And so going back to this earlier question of like whether or not race is actually correlated with economic outcome, the answer is yes, because it's encoded in the credit scores. And what you see here in the gray boxes is roughly the same dividing line, so 660 in this particular plot. But everyone in the gray box is basically prime. Everyone else is subprime. And you see immediately that the distribution for white looks very different from the Black and Hispanic ones, where you see that the Black and Hispanic historically have trended towards the subprime, and then improving over time so that more people are in prime. You can see that white already skewed very much towards prime, and that skew has increased over time. And so while all the populations have increasing and improving credit scores over time, which is great, there is still that lingering historical disparity, which encodes a lot of these systemic and structural inequalities that we see today in finance. A more subtle point is that even just using credit score as a variable itself introduces some potential for racial bias. And it's because whether or not you have a credit score also varies by race. So again, this is yet another study from the Federal Reserve and the CFPB that was published, and I would like to bring your attention to the graph on the right, which shows that if you are Asian or white, you have about a 17% chance of not having enough data to compute a credit score. Whereas if you belong to Black or Hispanic, like that number is almost 30%. And so there's almost a factor of 2 difference between like the best performing group and the worst performing subgroup. Now, so in summary, I'm not going to give the answer to whether or not policy C is actually fair or unfair, because it's almost not really the point. The point is really that we have to think about all of these various aspects, like the fact that there's input fairness and there's also output fairness, and they're both applicable theories of discrimination that come up. And also we have to worry about implicit correlations that are introduced through the data as well. So this is where the review that I wrote in 2018 left off. And it's very heartening to see that actually a lot has happened in 2021. So this is a very busy slide, but the key takeaway message is on the top left, that lawmakers and regulators are aware that existing regulations have their limits, and they are responding. There's new regulatory guidance being prepared, there are new standards being created, and there are new laws being drafted and passed right now. So the panel on the left, you'll see this is about the Apple Card, the issue of the fact that there were anecdotes that husband and wife couples apply, and then the husband gets like 10 times the credit limit of the other, or like the wife doesn't even get the credit card at all, even though they live in the same household. And so there was an actual investigation from the New York State regulator, which is the Department of Financial Services. And they issued a very interesting finding to say that, well, technically there were no fair lending violations. We still see the evidence that there's disparity in access to credit. And it's been 50 years, almost 50 years after the passage of the act supposedly outlawed it. And so this is a statement that is fairly unusual, because it's basically the regulators coming out and saying that technically this is fine, but we also know that the state of affairs is not fine, and we need to fix that somehow. So on the right, you see also like some snapshots from the Federal Register, which is the official journal of the federal government. Gosh, I'm sorry, I did that again. So we see actually a lot of action from multiple regulatory agencies, and there's interest to create regulatory guidance around what is a responsible AI framework, what does it mean to have AI risk, And also like, this is for those of you who are government policy wonks, like a request for information is usually the first stage towards saying, the regulators know that there is an issue, we want to fix it. The first step is public fact finding, and then following which they may circulate drafts, and then they will issue like, you know, drafts of the proposed rules and that kind of thing. So this is step one, and this happened earlier this year. And finally, perhaps relevant to this audience here at Barnard, is that last week, New York City became the first locality in the nation that has an AI regulatory bill. And it requires third-party independent audits of AI that's used for hiring decisions. And this is significant because it's not just about whether or not you operate in New York, but it's just like if your job description is being circulated in the New York market, like you have to pass this buyer's audit. So there's a lot of very interesting disruption in the regulatory space here that I think creates the market that we want to get into. All right. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to go through this one a bit lightly. But I just want to think about like the theme of today, and today's theme is about like diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I'll just share one anecdote about my name. So my name is written in English, as you see, but my name in Chinese is these characters. And when was this? Yeah, in July, I got this notice from Google Scholar that like, you have opened duplicate accounts and you should turn off the account that you don't want, otherwise we're going to delete your account. And I had to manually go and mark it as, yeah, that's not me. This is someone else who has the same name, but this person doesn't actually have my same name because his name in Chinese characters is actually quite different. And this is not a new problem. This is something that even the academic journals wrote about, like, 13 years ago when I was still working in physics. Like, they actually allowed people to publish with their names written in like their native scripts, and it was meant to disambiguate this problem of this auditorial which says which Wei Wang, and you can see that there are many names that all transliterate to the exact same English letters, but they're very, very different when you look at them in Chinese. And this was not a new observation by any means, but somehow Google Scholar didn't get the message. And this is just, to me, an example of a much larger problem. So we have examples of trans people who are really upset about being dead named in Google Scholar. We have also anecdotal evidence that people, other Chinese scholars adopt Western names or adopt fictitious middle initials just for the sake of disambiguation. What happens when women publish with their maiden names, or these days, like anybody who gets married who wants to change their last name, do they then have to go through the hassle of like updating all their academic records, or continue to publish in their maiden name because they don't want to lose their citation count, because that citation count is necessary for grants and status and promotions and things like that. So really, the problem here is a very simple root cause, like just assuming that names uniquely identify people when that's not actually the case. And so once you diagnose the root cause of this problem, I think you have some empathy for why this is difficult. Because names in real life are really hard, and once you encode some systemic assumption in your construction of your system, it's very, very hard to change. So I just point out that this thing that was popular about 10 years ago, falsehoods programmers believe about names, I think it makes a very powerful message of like, here are 40 different assumptions. I've just listed the first 11, but all of these assumptions are wrong. And you need to stop making these assumptions when you build a system. But the thing is, like, if you see this, like, I really like this call out at the end, which is like, the next time they suggest a genius idea, like a database table with a first name and last name, point them to this list of assumptions about names. But you see, the problem is once you chose that as your design, now you have to completely undo it to fix all of these problems. And just on the right, you see a couple of these examples of quote unquote corner cases, but nonetheless belong to real people. So for example, the person on the top right has a hyphenated last name, and the hyphen is not recognized as a valid character in the name. That's just, well, that's a design assumption that now has come back to bite you. The one in the middle, hello, I'm Mr. Null, or Null, it's how it's pronounced. Null, as you know, is a common representation for null values in databases, and so this creates all sorts of problems for somebody who would be with the actual last name of null. And then the one on the bottom right is something that maybe is a bit less familiar, but it's really talking about Chinese characters that are too rare to represent in Unicode. So as you know, that Unicode already contains something like 32,000 Chinese characters, which is a lot of Chinese characters. But guess what? It's not all of them. And because Chinese is so homophonic, there's such high possibilities of having names that sound exactly the same. People do use these rare characters in names as a way to disambiguate people in writing. And so this is an example that was published in the New York Times, saying that they were considering passing laws to actually outlaw the use of certain characters which were not representable by computer. And these people just have their names written out by hand because this character doesn't exist in the character set. So the problem here that I wanted to highlight and maybe pause here for discussion is that if you really want to design inclusive systems, it means that we need to confront assumptions about how things are built, and we need to fix them. But sometimes fixing these things means you have to like redo the entire system. So who's going to pay for that? And that's really part of the issue here about why DEI is really expensive. It's not just like somebody's problem. It's the fact that like the whole system is broken and we need to fix it. So that was the message of today, that like, you know, names is maybe a little bit of a simple example, but it's one that I think many of us face. But also, like, you think about like the financial system and how it's broken, like all of the historical accidents that created this universe that we live in. We have to live with that. And if we need to go back and fix broken assumptions in that system, it means we have to redo the entire system. And now how do you do that without destroying the entire world economy in the process? And on that very pessimistic note, I'll just pause here and thank you all for your attention, and we'll turn it over for discussion.
Thank you so much for that really exciting talk. I have a lot of things going on in my head. And off the bat, I do have a couple questions at the top of my head, but I feel like we should open it up to the audience because we had such a great interactive talk. And so I wonder if somebody right at the top has a question or a comment. Feel free to unmute yourself.
I do have a small question regarding the names. I don't want to like offend anybody, but I want to like understand how big the problem is, you know, like like you talk about the Chinese character and, you know, being very rare and you know, not existing in the Unicode itself, and how like you know, hyphenated last names are not recognized, and the you know, existence of keywords in the programming language which is causing a problem. So my question is like how impactful are these problems, and what is, I think that would help us understand why they have not been fixed, and you know, what could be the demotivating factor for it, for fixing
No, it's a great point. And so I will say, like, probably there's a long tail. I don't have the exact statistics to quote you, but there's also a problem in diagnosing it in your own system, because guess what? If you don't allow hyphenated last names, they won't be in your system, so you don't have the data to actually tell. This is actually this information asymmetry between like mistakes and the positive cases. It's actually emblematic of like a much more general problem. So if you go back to like the financial services question of like, you know, how do we know that we're excluding people from the financial system? Given the data I have, like everybody I have is a customer. Now the problem is there's an information asymmetry between false positives for credit decisions and false negatives for credit decisions. So a false positive is somebody who was not creditworthy, and then you gave that person a credit card, and then they charged it all up, and then they ran away and didn't pay the bill. So that is a material loss that you have to eat on your balance sheet. But a false negative, somebody you didn't take on as a customer, but should have been a customer, is a counterfactual. This person does not exist in your data. And so this is pointing to a limitation of a data-driven approach to even answering that kind of question of exclusion. Because guess what? If you've excluded that person from the system, you just don't have data about that person. So if you run the test, it's going to be like, oh yeah, like nobody complained because all my customers are happy. And like, well, all your customers are the people who don't have hyphenated surnames. So those people, you've lost out on an entire market segment of people who couldn't type their name into your system.
Yeah, I understand that. Yeah, makes sense.
And like, again, not to over stereotype, but like, like there are cultures in various parts of India, Southeast Asia that don't use last names. And I had this problem when I was trying to buy someone a plane ticket, and this person only had one name, and so I couldn't buy a ticket for that person online. I had to call customer service, and they said, oh, the next time, so they were able to do it over the phone, but then they also said, like, next time this happens, you just type the same name twice. And that's how they decided to encode that in their system. So like, how are you supposed to know that, right? So these are corner cases where, like, okay, yeah, there are workarounds, and you see how people evolve to manage those corner cases, but it's not natural, right? These are not intuitive workarounds.
Yeah, I kind of agree. Even for me, I don't have a middle name on one of the websites. I am Rahul N.A. Agarwal. So yeah.
Any other questions?
I have a question. I think it's related to something someone said in the chat as well. So maybe I'll read their question first even. So what are the ways that people and organizations in this place are working to fix algorithms like this? Like, if current calculations of credit score do cause this disparity, then how are people going about recalculating it in a way that is actually equitable? So I work on modeling in this space, and sometimes we're conditioned to be fair, subject to credit score. It's like you're allowed to, for each credit group, you have to have some fairness constraint or something like this. So I wonder, like, does anybody know about, or Gia, how do you know about, like, when they designed this credit score, were they thinking just about this like input fair and not the output fair? Or is there any interest in moving it towards some output fair setup at some point?
So let me say some tangential things, which are, guess what? Data brokers, like credit bureaus, are not regulated the same way as banks. So banks assume all the downstream liability for using something that's biased. And so to the extent that they are not regulated, credit bureaus don't have explicit incentives to fix it. But of course, like, if it's something manifestly obvious and broken, then people are not going to use it. Right? So let me go back and reshare this one slide here. So there is something that I've been thinking a lot about the past few years, and it's the fact that if you look carefully, half of your credit score is basically dependent on the value of your past credit score. So if you look at payment history, length of credit history, these are 50% of your credit score, and to some extent, amounts owed as well is also historical. And so there's a very strong feedback cycle just set up in the definition of what a credit score is. And so this is why, when I first came to the US, they said, like, okay, get your starter credit card right away. It's so important in this country to build a credit report, get a credit score, and then, like, get like the cheapo credit card from Capital One. It turns out much later I realized that Capital One actually specializes in subprime lenders. Get the $500 starter card, use it, charge it up, pay it off, be responsible, and then you can, like, upgrade to, like, the American Express, like the Chase credit cards, like the more premium credit cards with, like, the travel miles and the bonuses and, like, all the side benefits. So and this is why I brought up the historical aspects of banking and understanding that social and economic history is so important, because it really depends on, like, if 50% of your credit score depends on your past credit score, then think of the fact that, like, the desegregation as part of the Civil Rights Act happened in 1970, and there are still people alive that predated that, right? So I forgot to prepare this question, which is, does anyone want to guess in what year women were allowed to open a bank account in their own name in the United States?
1970.
We have a guess in the chat, 1976 or 74 as well.
Wow, okay, 1974 was right on the money. So 1974 was the first year you could open a bank account without your husband or father's permission. So just think about that, and now think forward to 2020 when people complain about gender imbalance in the Apple Card. But guess what? Those people who were not able to open bank accounts in their name, a lot of them are still alive. They're in your data. And like, how does that work if like you have assets, you have money, you have wealth, but it's all in your husband's name or all in your father's name? Like that doesn't show up on your credit report. It shows up on like the spouse, right? So this is, I don't know. I don't know the answer to your question, Will, but I do think that it's very important to think about this historical bias that is amplified through this feedback mechanism of like by virtue of design of what this number is.
Yeah, thank you.
So building on that, right? So I mean, I think what you're saying is even if we had a perfect credit score, meaning if we have a mechanism that today could tell you someone's likelihood of defaulting on a loan today, and so, from a mathematical financial perspective, that seems quite fair. You're saying because people's ability to be in a position of having wealth and all of that is itself dependent on historical inequities and current inequities that are structural racism, structural sexism, and all that. It feels like you're saying there's inherently no fair way to regard these questions, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. But then I come back to so if you're in the position of designing systems that have to work with data and work with decisions, what can you take from that, and how can you try to do better? I mean, do you have to just step back and say, I'm not going to even live in that world, I'm going to try and fix the world and change the world and do other things, or what would you recommend?
This is such a great question. So it is indeed what I'm trying to say, that like even if you were fair today, there's no guarantee that because of historical biases in your input data, that will not continue to amplify in the future. And so remediation therefore has to be a continuous process of feedback and observation and intervention, rather than like a one-off in a single point in time. So then that's just a property of the fact that credit is a dynamical system, right? Like, every month there's new data on like your behavior. Okay, you lost your job, you got a new job, you have income volatility. Like, how does that affect your credit score? And now the question is of what to do with it. It's also really interesting, because what if I want to implement an affirmative action type thing to say, like, if you're Black, I know you're historically disadvantaged, I want to give you like some sort of bonus, some sort of affirmative like incentive. I cannot do it by lowering my standards for this disadvantaged group because they're disparate treatment. Now, there's something very interesting here, because you can see that even with the right intentions, the law actually makes it illegal. So the law has to change if we want that to happen. This is not true in other jurisdictions. In the UK, they don't have this idea of disparate treatment. And so it is actually perfectly legal to implement some sort of affirmative action. Now, I'll say this with one caveat, which is that the regulations for the Equal Credit Opportunity Act actually allow for something called a special purpose credit program, which is designed for affirmative action, and it is legal, but you have to follow the very specific rules to create an SPCP. And to my understanding, there's only one bank that ever created one, and that was Chase, and they launched it last year. And so this carve-out has existed on the books for almost 50 years. It took until last year for someone to actually bring to market something that was allowed by the regulation, because people just didn't think it was worth bringing to market.
So I have, oh, you go ahead and then I can ask my question after you.
Oh, okay, sweet. So I think a very interesting thing to think about is moving towards fair AI. Say in the case of like banks or something, from an internal versus external standpoint. And what I mean by that is having a fair AI team on a bank or somewhere like Facebook or something like that, versus having external AI fairness startups and companies like Parity. I was wondering how you think, what role you think both of those two play in creating fair AI. Yeah, I guess that's all. But I guess like the easy answer is like we need both. But yeah.
So, you know, as you know, so in disclosure, like Will and Brandon are both colleagues from JP Morgan, so it's good to see you. I tried doing that at JP Morgan Chase for 2 years, and I tried to start the ethical AI practice at Capital One. This is one of those things where like you will shop around and like anybody worth their salary in management or leadership will say, duh, obviously we need fairness in banking. Obviously, I want my product to not discriminate. I want to like include everybody. But how you actually end up operationalizing it is literally the billion-dollar question that people get stuck on, right? So what does fairness mean for my problem? You know, in finance, we talk about fair lending compliance as like, well, here's an obvious one, but there's also things like there's micro frictions in processes that have outsized disparate impact, right? So if you think about KYC, for example, this is know your customer, and this is why opening a bank account in this country like can sometimes be instantaneous and sometimes it takes weeks or months, because we need to do that background check to know, do we believe that you are who you say you are in your application for a bank account? And do we think that you have suspicious connections to drug lords, human traffickers, other aspects of financial crime? If we think that you're going to get money from these sources, we're not going to do business with you, right? So just think about the fact that if you have new wealth rather than generational wealth, right? If you have generational wealth, my family has banked with JP Morgan for 200 years, and I want a new bank account for my son, no problem, right? Okay, I'm like a YouTube sensation, and I made like, you know, $30 million in the last 5 years, and now I go.
Interesting example.
Right. For example, I will not comment as to whether this is a real client or not, but you know, like, and like you go through that process and you go like, where did you get your money from? And like imagine like, you know, some old timer banker going like, you know, what's TikTok? Like, how do you make money off TikTok? And like just thinking of that, and like just the extra legwork they need to do to understand where your money came from if you're not already an existing customer or have some sort of historical family ties in that business relationship, right? So there are all of these things, and then like what we talked about a little bit at the end about financial exclusion as well is also important, right? Like the fact that like if I use AI to just reproduce the status quo that my current business practice is doing, unless I build in an explicit willingness to gamble and do that exploration, to take a chance on an unseen customer that was not in my data set, I'm just going to reproduce the people that I already have. And if that means that I only have wealthy clients from, you know, the Mayflower family from Boston, then, you know, nobody who didn't come from the Mayflower and don't have that ancestry of being a Boston Brahmin, they're not going to be able to open a bank account with you.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense.
I wanted to quickly go back to the big question that you posed at the end of your talk, which was about just system redesign, that in order to rethink the way that bias works in these systems, which were primarily case studies that you presented from the US and laws and regulations that exist in the US. But even just taking the example, the Google Scholar example, and the way names are introduced, the way that forms are made, the way in which ASCII characters don't incorporate other kinds of characters, things like that. And the fact that, for example, Facebook was designed and developed in the US, and yet most of its users are outside of the US, something like 94%. So when you think about the system redesign question, it's a big question. And so I'm wondering, is that something that you pose to us to think about, or do you actually have ideas about how that might even begin to work in different contexts, cultural and social contexts outside of the US?
Yeah, so part of your question, I think, overlaps with an earlier question that we need that stakeholder buy-in. We need the leadership to agree, and we need the leadership to back you when you want to change the system and reform the system, because that systemic change is painful, and you're going to upset people who are entrenched in the system and don't want to see the boat rot because they have something locked down. So that's part of this the issue. I think another part of the issue is just like, who is even involved in that discussion, right? Like it can't be, so one thing that I really enjoyed from my time at JP Morgan was that I got to meet Jamie Dimon personally. And I told him I was working on fairness, and his response was, how much would it cost to make the bank more fair? I'll write the check for it. Just tell me what to do. So I'm like, okay, it's great. Like, like it's, how often do you work at a place where like literally the top person in the company just says, go make it happen. But then you go like down the organizational chart and be like, oh, I need to loop in model risk, I need to loop in legal and compliance, and you need to build those relationships, you need to establish your credibility that you know what you're talking about. And then that becomes this, that's where all like the messiness, right? Dealing with people that are mostly 99% of them are like not overtly malicious or evil. They just have their role to play in a big system, and they're comfortable. They took years and years to become expert in that, and that's what they want to do. And they want to see change because now they have to redo the whole thing. But that's necessary if you want to redesign the system. So you got to get everyone on board to say like, we got to fix all of this together, and not feel like you are working against them actively, but rather like helping them like move on to like, I don't know, like the next chapter, right? Because otherwise you're just going to end up with like the Luddites, like the people who destroyed the looms and all of that, right? So like that history of technical innovation, like there's centuries and centuries of history to show that people don't respond well to technological changes because they feel like they're going to be left out. And we're going to have this discussion today about, oh, the AI is going to take my jobs. And, like, how do you address that very valid fear that people's jobs will be disrupted, and maybe people don't want their jobs to be disrupted?
Yeah. So do you have something to add to that?
I was going to ask if that answered your question.
Yeah, I think partially, but also that makes me think about your work at Parity. And I'm wondering, can you talk a little bit more explicitly as to how, is it certain projects that you take on, certain organizations that you work with that deal with certain kinds of biases, like the ones that you spoke about today? We also have a question in the chat from somebody called Andy Ma, who is wondering whether Parity is recruiting any full-time positions or internships at the moment. So if you have a place where you can direct anyone who's listening right now to that.
Yeah, so we're really like in a super early stage of fundraising. So we hope to raise over the next few months, and so please definitely check back. I think the easiest way is to follow me on Twitter or LinkedIn. If you have trouble finding me, I can paste that, and you can always email me directly. So I'll paste the link to the slides. Apologies, like some people seem to have like access permissions. I'll go fix that after the talk. But here's the link here. And here's my email. Did I answer all of it, or did I forget something?
So the first part of, can you talk a little bit more about your work at Parity?
Yeah, so we're building tools to try to enable this multi-stakeholder and collaborative engagement. So let me share my screen, and this is not in my slide deck for today, but this is from my research paper from last year. So I can send this around. But one of the things I did when I was at Chase was to really try to kind of debug, as it were, or like discover what the actual model development lifecycle looked like, because the model developers know that they build a thing, they send it to model risk, and they send it to compliance, and then stuff comes back, and compliance sees that little bit where like, okay, we review models, but like and then we send it back and we approve or reject things, but it felt like nobody really had a very clear idea of like how the whole sausage is made from start to finish. And this was part of the I'll call it like industrial sociology or anthropology work, that is like, people don't think of this as AI or even computer science, but it's so important to understand the context of what you're building. And this is what we ended up with, this horrendous mess here. So let me walk through the highlights of this. So if you follow the quote unquote textbook model of data science, just follow the black boxes. So first we figure out what data we want. Then we do some feature engineering, clean up the data. Now we train the model. Now we make sure that we have tests to make sure that it's correct, and then we put it in production, and money comes out of the AI machine or something. But what happens in banks is that because there is need to have compliance review, model risk review, all of these things are effectively presented currently within the organization in an adversarial manner, to say, I need to be that gatekeeper, the literal gatekeeper, to say, you need to pass my exam to make sure that model risk is adequately mitigated for, that fair lending risk is appropriately mitigated for, before I allow you to send this into production. So they literally are there to be that adversary, to make sure that you've done that. And this is again not due to maliciousness. This is just literally like their job function as it is defined today. And so if it fails any step of the review, they have the authority to kick it back to a previous stage. And it could be going back to train a new model, or go all the way back and say like, no, this problem is just a really bad problem to be working on, go find something else to do. And so imagine you spent like all of this time to get to this point where you validate, and like just before you ship to production, these people come in and they go like, oh, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that. And then I think the very natural response, if you've already gone through all of this, is like, why didn't you tell me sooner? And so this is a question of like, process, if it's broken, it causes a lot of headache, right? So it in reality, like, it can take like years to build a new model and deploy in production. And that's a problem. So the thing we're building at Parity, I don't have a slide for this, is to say, why don't we just re-engineer the actual the actual political situation, the organizational structure, so that it's not purely adversarial, but we don't compromise people's ability to do their review functions. And that means like making sure that it's collaborative, like everyone's concerns, if they have concerns, they're brought up early on in the model development process. We're not wasting CPU cycles and dev time on fruitless things like, oh, like using this feature only to realize that, oh, this feature is biased, so don't use that feature. And then the model developer gets annoyed because, oh, guess what? I spent like 3 months like calibrating my model using this data, and now you want me to redo all of that. Yeah. So that's what we're doing. We're trying to use AI to make this a less adversarial and more collaborative process, but at the same time not compromising the ability for review to happen, and for tests to be there, for checks to be there. And right now we're not seeing anything like this on the market. And I think what a lot of things on the market are like tooling things, like monitoring the model in production to make sure that it stays within acceptable parameters. Or we see like technical solutions like, oh, don't know what your model's doing, apply this explainable AI tool, and then like, now you're compliant. And anyone who's worked in a bank for more than, I don't know, 2 months will quickly realize like how naive that is. It's just not realistic, because it's embedded in this much bigger organizational process. And if you really want to fix the process, which you have to do if you want to actually reduce the cost of all of this compliance, then we actually need to be cognizant of the organizational context of what you're doing, and make sure that the tool that we build is actually going to address everybody's needs. It can't just be one person's needs, one role's needs, because like imagine I build this for legal, but then it doesn't actually make things easier for model risk. The model risk will go like, well, okay, why do we have this? It doesn't help me with my job. It doesn't help me do the model review. So they're just going to ignore it. So we don't want that, and that's the high level vision for what we want to build at Parity, to make that multi-stakeholder process happen in a more collaborative and efficient manner.
Thank you for explaining that. I really appreciate it. And we're coming up at the end of the hour. I know that there are some more questions. We're getting thank yous in the chat. I've gotten some questions about the link to this recording, which we will post, and you can follow us on Twitter. I've put our information in the chat again. And I wanted to thank you, Jiahao, for such an engaging talk. And I really appreciated all of you who joined us and participated and made this a really interactive discussion. And I also wanted to introduce Rebecca Wright, who is our faculty director. I wasn't able to introduce her at the beginning, but she did ask a question at the end of the talk. And yes, I would like to encourage you to follow us and stay tuned, and thank Jiahao once again.